How are you guys today? This will be our fourth podcast, and you guys are gonna be able to.
Are we up to four?
We're up to four now.
Whoa,
I think.
whoa.
Yeah, this one's gonna be. We're gonna start putting them up on YouTube, so you guys are gonna get a nice surprise pretty soon. But we're here. We're a foreign policy podcast. We call ourselves a Gonzo podcast because we're sort of academics, but not really. I mean, Henry's an academic, but I'm not really.
Kind of.
The
way in which this academic world works is you're an academic when the university wants you to needs something from you. After they're done with you for the semester, they don't fucking want anything else to do with you. You can go back to collecting unemployment. You can go be a fucking Uber driver. The university doesn't give a fuck. Oh wait, there's somebody who needs a professor needs to be replaced. Hey, look who's on our little rotary dial. Let's give this guy a call. See if he wants to come work for us again.
Yeah, Henry was just grading papers, his finals.
God.
Here in La Mesa at a bar, which is, I think, the proper procedure. Everyone knows it's a proper procedure for grading Blue Book or Green Book tests or whatever they are in your
whatever
university.
you want to call them. Like when we were undergrads, they were Blue Books, but now you got to get with the times. So they're Green Books because they're made out of recycled paper.
But green is like the most toxic ink to produce. So I don't. Well. Anyways, right, we're here. We're here in La Mesa, and today we were, there's something that went under the radar in the news that we wanted to hit up because we're both Cold War historians or historians of the Cold War. I believe is the more proper.
That's probably the correct way of putting it.
And the Afghanistan Papers came out in the Washington Post, and they came out with a whimper.
Yes.
I believe Henry has not had a chance to read any of them. I've read the first two.
I glanced through it a little bit.
But you know what? The interesting thing is that they functionally include just a rehashing of information that basically we know about Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And the reason we wanted to talk about Afghanistan today is because the entire Afghan war and the Iraq war, when taken together, represent something that I think has been particularly strong in American foreign policy in the last 20 years, which is massive strategic failure. You enter a war with no strategic goal. And this is what happened in Afghanistan. And in Iraq, the strategic goal was completely unrealistic, which was I believe, the democratic tsunami that would have made a pro-American Middle East.
Yeah.
And, 19 years later, now, it's going to be 19 years in 2020.
God.
I mean, actually, in September of 2020, it'll be 19 years. And how is it that we're able to do that? What is it particularly about the United States that you can have a war go on that long, and the entire war fatigue is just not an issue? Henry's cell phone went off. He didn't put it on silence.
It's Jose talking about Abraham.
It's our fantasy basketball league updates.
That will go off all fucking day.
But shit, man, how did we get to fucking 20 years?
Let's talk about this. How do you get yourself dug into a 20-plus year war?
George Kennan is how we get there. Containment is how we got there.
Containment strategy, sure.
So this is my theory. I believe my theory is as absolute, and
the correct interpretation of 20th century.
No one can gain
21st century now.
So one thing that was there was a book that came out, I believe, in 1989 or was it 1992 called "We All Lost the Cold War."
Oh,
we all lost the Cold War. And
I was thinking of either John Lewis Gaddis's very cocky book. We now know.
We now know. Yes, we now know. We now know that you know nothing, Jon Snow. We all know that you know nothing, Jon Snow.
There was the end of history, which was also kind of around that same time.
And I got to see Fukuyama speak at Cornell, and I think it was 2009, and he sort of was there like mea culpa. He admitted that he had definitely overstepped in declaring the end of history, especially since it feels like we're back to the 1930s.
Yeah. It feels like late 1940s. Early 1950s. We're maybe like a few steps away from like full-blown fucking McCarthyism.
Well, I think we're worse. The global situation is a bit worse than that.
The global situation.
We're back in the 1930s again.
In terms
and
of...
it's very terrifying. But, we got there, I think, in part because the permanent war state. The perpetual war state that we have going on. And I think that I was someone who worked on Eisenhower. And it's interesting to see that his warnings about the military-industrial complex. And yes, I was reading James Ledbetter lately, Unwarranted Influence. If you have not read that book and you want to understand, the sort of like the intellectual background behind the military-industrial complex, that is something you should be reading. It's fucking awesome. And I think that the problem we have right now is that we're in a perpetual war, state of perpetual war, and we can't get out of it. We're in the national security state, and then part of that is containment. George Kennan's conceptualization of us having to constantly contain these existential threats, whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's fundamentalist Islam, whether apparently now it's practically everyone is China. How the fuck? That's how we get to Afghanistan.
I think what they've done is they've taken some of George Kennan's containment theories and they've mixed it with all this neocon bullshit about regime change and spreading democracy through the Middle East. And if you look, I've only had a chance to kind of gradually look through some of the Afghan papers and read part of that story in the Washington Post. But part of it is all about how, throughout the years, they're always talking about how they can change the government of Afghanistan. They can bring democracy to Afghanistan, which has never had any kind of, any type of government that hasn't been, feudal warlords controlling that. Afghanistan is a country that, is a country in name only.
Yeah, it's the poorest country in the world, and that's the.
The biggest problem is these boundaries are not. The little tribe that lives, 100 miles outside of Kabul doesn't recognize the government as, that's our government in Kabul.
Well, I think the biggest problem is you have a country that is its own democratic credentials are suspect.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest issue. Is that what's your model for rebuilding Afghanistan from the very inception? And the model was supposed to be Germany and Japan, and you have two countries which have an intense national identity in the 20th century, and you're going to just somehow replicate that success. But the problem is, it's not just that you have Afghanistan, right? It's that once you invade Iraq, all the monumental resources you would have needed in Afghanistan in terms of manpower and attention get diverted to a war that is illegal. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the biggest problems, I think, in American foreign policy, is that the United States commit a massive war crime in Iraq. And I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic. I think that's
the truth.
It's the truth.
It was not declared, the United Nations did not approve of this. If Russia went and did this, we would have been outraged.
Right. There was no jus bellum, right? Your pretext for war was illegal, and as a result, you have trillions of dollars that were evaporated in Iraq, and Afghanistan is now still a failed state. And the problem is, we've been here before, right?
Yeah.
This sounds vaguely familiar. Didn't this happen in South Vietnam? Yes, this happened in South Vietnam. For those of you who don't know, in South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the dictator of South Vietnam, he was the one that the Americans tapped in 1955, I believe, in the Geneva courts to basically rule South Vietnam. And there was a brief, I want to say it was brief, but he had a brief window between 1955 and 1957 where he might have been able to create sort of a South Vietnam. What happened is the basic failure to do all sorts of things, especially land reform, led to widespread peasant rebellion by 1957. Yeah. By then he had already failed. And the United States lingered in South Vietnam until 1973.
Continues even though Diem's land reforms are all failing, the United States is just continuing to find itself getting deeper and deeper into Vietnam. Sending more and more troops into Vietnam. It expands. Nobody wants to withdraw. Nobody wants to get out of this.
The dominoes will fall.
Yes, this ridiculous theory.
So what's going on in Afghanistan, right? So Afghanistan falls. There's a domino theory to fundamentalist
What
Islam.
happens to does Pakistan go after that?
Pakistan's still going
but
after
they're
that.
already. Pakistan is not. It's hardly this beacon of
But
democracy.
why is this our problem? Is the issue, right? So once you go in and you wipe the floor with Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and the Taliban that exists now they're still Henry and I are both fucking atheists. For us, all religious fundamentalists are an existential threat to your existence. But at the same time, these are what is our role? What positive role can we have in rebuilding Afghanistan? And I don't think at this point we can have one, because in part, both Obama and Donald Trump now have essentially continued, an essential counterinsurgency campaign there. And Trump is supposed to, I think, announced the withdrawal of 4,000 troops. But at the same time, he's doing it at a point where American foreign policy is being vilified all over the world. So, we don't even have the opportunity to withdraw from Afghanistan in a negotiated settlement that may have the support of everyone in the region. And I'm sorry, but leaving Afghanistan without being able to talk to Iran is fucking madness. Right, leaving Afghanistan while you have strained relations with Pakistan because of your own positions in foreign policy is madness, and even with China, right? We have a car that almost crashed right in front of us because we're here facing the highway. I can see the entire Spring Street from here in La Mesa. But yeah, these are the crazy things that happen in California. But I think that car crash that almost happens sort of is emblematic of American foreign policy.
Good analogy for American foreign policy.
The massive strategic failure, right? And that's the thing, is that, we can't ignore the giant elephant in the room, which is apt because it was the Republican Party who got us in this mess in the first place. Yeah. But then it was the Democratic Party who kept up these neoconservative wars, right?
Yeah. Let's not try to make the Democrats the heroes out of all this. Resistance heroes. They went along with all this, Obama, especially after 9/11. It was so easy to just get behind the warfare state.
Obama, he expanded their own campaigns, and what Donald Trump has gleefully expanded even more. Mm-hmm. But I believe that the Democratic Party establishment has been buying these neoconservative arguments about foreign policy and about security, and as a result, they were not able to muster the courage to pull us out of Iraq and Afghanistan, which is what they should have done.
Well, they probably had no exit strategy to begin with. I mean, it's easy enough to get yourself into these wars. It's hard enough
to, This is Cold War bullshit. This peace with honor shit is Cold War bullshit.
They never fucking learned the lessons.
Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, worshipped Henry Kissinger, just demonstrates that we're buying into some of the neoconservative ideas and Republican Cold War ideas about the way foreign policy works. So these are Nixonian ideas of you show weakness and it destroys you. The wars themselves have sapped us materially, right? You can't just dismiss the fact that, what was it, $5 or $7 trillion were blown away in Afghanistan. Where's our universal health care, right? There's our fucking universal health care, killing fucking Afghans and Iraqis by the hundreds of thousands. And
there's ample money for missiles. There's ample money for tanks. There's ample money for drones. There's no money for fucking schools. There's no money for fucking healthcare. The roads are falling apart in this country. We have fucking a homeless crisis now in San Diego.
Oh my God.
In San Francisco, New York City. Everywhere you go, you're finding it's fucking everywhere. And we have giant fucking wildfires in California now every fucking fall.
I mean, the scale of the foreign policy fuck up has been enough to actually dent our government's finances, and that's a big issue. Not a big issue. That's a fundamental issue of all this, right? That the neoconservatives have allowed American politicians at the federal government level to allocate so much importance to these political decisions, and that's what they are. I mean, this is what Iraq and Afghanistan are. This is George Bush pulling out his cock and saying, fuck all of you. I'm going to piss all over the world, and we all got to get behind me while I do it. And that's what happened. And I really despise the sort of softening of people's attitudes towards George Bush. Just because Donald Trump is a neo-Nazi doesn't mean that George Bush isn't the worst president that we've ever had. Because
in my book, Donald Trump is a horrible fucking person. He's a horrible president. Yet if you ask me, pound for pound, who is the worst president that we've ever had, I'm still George W. Bush. Andrew Jackson too. Yeah. Different levels of awfulness.
Different awfulness. And sort of apt because Andrew Jackson is Donald Trump's fucking hero.
Yeah.
And I thought the Afghanistan Papers coming out with a whimper was so incredible. The collective apathy and fatigue over the war manifests in people just not fucking caring.
People, we don't have the same connection to the war in Afghanistan that people had with, say, the Vietnam War. There's not that same. You don't have a draft. I mean, not as many people are coming home in body bags. Our people aren't necessarily dying at the same rate.
Our people, right?
Our people.
The biggest problem, I think, is the shock and awe doctrine, and with the drone wars, is that we've tried to sanitize war.
Mm-hmm. We tried to make it nice and clean. But if you actually read about this, there's still those people who are controlling the drones in their nice cushy fucking air conditioned room in Florida are actually still having PTSD.
Oh yeah, of course they know they're killing.
Yeah.
It still has a toll.
It still takes a mental toll on you.
Yeah, of course. So they're human beings, and I remember reading a story. I think it was the New York Times. This woman, she was firing a missile in Afghanistan. And she started yelling at the monitor at last moment, "Get out!" to the people who she was killing. And it's not that I don't think that our soldiers are immoral in that sense, right? I mean, yes, there are cases like the people that Trump pardoned recently.
Yeah, I was trying to remember his name off the top of my head.
But in part, we don't. I believe that the people who make these decisions, who aren't experiencing these problems, who aren't experiencing PTSD, the people like Paul Wolfowitz or David Frum, who are the ones who advocated these wars to begin with.
Donald Rumsfeld.
The Rumsfelds, right? They're the ones who the war criminality falls on.
The people who went back and looked at Vietnam and said, the problem wasn't that we were in Vietnam. The problem was that we withdrew from Vietnam and didn't continue to fight this war.
And I met people like that. I TA'd for people like that in grad school.
God.
Like
that whole Henry Jackson mentality.
Right, but, and some of them were involved in the war.
Yeah.
And some of them were not involved in the war. And the problem is that the United States has managed to make war distant to Americans. They made it distant. But it's costing us here. That's the issue, right? Aside from all the veterans we have all fucked up everywhere, the military budget, it keeps growing and growing and growing.
Every year.
This is containment. When people are trying to figure out why are we the way we are, I'm telling everyone who's listening, the problem is that at the very inception of the Cold War, we believed that there was some sort of material sacrifice we had to make to beat these big bad guys.
Yeah.
And we've
kept
it up
communism from reaching American shores.
In perpetuity. And the issue is that this feeds into the way Americans rule. Because, for example, if this was really about containment, right, and I tell people this all the time because I worked on Cuba, if our foreign policy is really guided by these moral issues about defeating these tyrannical governments, then when we shook hands with China and with the Soviet Union in 1973, with détente, how come Cuba was left out of that, right? If it was really about existential crises, then how come the Cuban government was frozen out of this détente? Because the Cuban government is to this day is still treated like a pariah by the United States. And I'm someone who's a critic of the Cuban government, right? I believe that the Cuban government is is authoritarian. It's done some things right, especially with regards to education and healthcare, but in terms of its civil liberties, it's failed completely, and it's betrayed. I feel like Castro had betrayed completely his own values in the way that he governed in the years after 1959.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what the fuck? There's a definite the fuck here.
Let's just go back and really quick explain to people who don't know what détente is. Détente it's a French word. It means the lessening of tensions. So typically we use this term détente to describe a relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, say from Richard Nixon to roughly through the Ford years, maybe even into the Carter years, to the first 2 years of Jimmy Carter, maybe. After certainly by the time the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, you're into talking about a whole new world, a whole new Cold War, basically.
Although the détente continues with China.
Yeah. So it's not just a one-way path.
So Sino-American confrontation after the Cold War period ends is sort of like a slow burn. It starts increasing as China gets more powerful, and it really starts reaching the place where it is right now during Barack Obama. That's when we start seeing as China's assertiveness, particularly in the South China Sea. It's sort of weird because I think that historians of East and Southeast Asia have a better grasp of it than we do. Because I worked on Caribbean, and Henry works on domestic United States, and it was like what we see in East Asia is that in Japan and South Korea there was this long-term trend towards questioning the alliance, but because of the state of China's assertiveness. Now you're seeing that, South Korea is more flexible in this regard, right? South Korea, if they can get even a deal with China to end the Korean War, they'll take it. But, Japan ultimately sees, itself as being in an existential conflict with China, and China the same way. Long story short, the elements for us to continue a containment policy are still all there. Because you can always justify having some sort of existential fucking fight with someone.
And this was at the heart of what the Cold War was. This whole Cold War, when that fell apart in 1989, suddenly we're losing our whole raison d'être. What the fuck do you say that?
Raison d'être.
Yes. Our reasons for
Henry
existence.
knows French words. I actually studied French.
I can't actually speak. I know these words in theory. I know what they are. I know what they mean. I just can't fucking read them. So anyway, my point with this was that once the Cold War ends, this whole mentality of what do we replace communism with? How do we support the military-industrial complex if we don't have this existential threat from the Soviet Union? All right, well, it's got to be human rights. It's got to be about Noriega, drug trafficking, and human rights. Saddam Hussein. human rights.
It's Americans don't believe that peace is a possible state of affairs.
Yeah.
That if you're not somewhere fighting, it shows weakness. And I think this is one of the biggest weaknesses in American foreign policy, and as a consequence of the Cold War period. And that's when we say a perpetual warfare state is a state that believes that if its military isn't asserting itself abroad, it's showing this passivity. And I think the Chinese government more recently is starting to show evidence of having the same values. And in part, they get it from fucking us, right? Because if we're the model for power in the 20th century and now the 21st century, the world is fucked. And, don't even get me started in Russian foreign policy, because it's basically conditioned by us and us by them. I think that the United States and Russia are the two most fucking degenerate states in the world today, right?
Yeah.
We're the most immoral countries when it comes to our foreign policy. And China's starting to behave in that way. And then, India with Modi, right? Interesting with offering citizenship to everyone except for the largest minority in the fucking country.
Yeah.
You're starting to see these nationalistic politics believe that if you have to somehow create a victim narrative or a apocalyptic struggle in order to have a coherent foreign policy, and all this is a fallacy. Oh, this is all fallacious. For people who are listening, man, this is not the way the world needs to fucking work. It is possible to have fucking peace. You don't need to spend, $700 billion or $750 billion on your defense establishment. In part because I can tell you the diminishing returns on this are incredible. You're not getting your $750 billion worth of security and influence in the world by spending that much money. And that's the thing that Americans cannot accept.
It's hard to wrap your head around when you're taught that the American government is always the good guys in the world, that we're off doing, we're saving the world, we're saving the world from democracy and things of that nature. But why do you spend $700 billion on your military? You're spending $700 billion if you're committed to the empire. And we don't
say that's a dirty word. You can't say the E word.
The United States is an empire? What?
That's the E word. What? You can't say that, but it's true.
We have 1,000+ bases. I mean, we have it's something like 800 known bases, but the actual number, there's somewhere over 1,000+ bases.
And this is a really important point. I mean, Henry gets to the fucking heart of matter, right? So when people talk about the United States being an empire, and I think this is important for understanding not just 50, 60 years ago, but in understanding what we are right now. The way that we built our opposition to the Soviet Union in the Cold War was to make a system of alliances, military alliances. And these military alliances were solidified by two things: military aid and bases. And these are all over the world, every possible fucking country, except for countries that specifically do not participate in our web. And there's only a few countries, believe it or not, that don't. And one of the most prominent, and you see this in the news all the time, is Syria. Syria is actually historically a Soviet satellite country. It is a Soviet military ally. And so when people talk about the war in Syria and why the Russians are so involved, that's why. This is why.
It's been
Russians being in Syria is basically a normal thing.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they have a positive influence.
They
have the same role that we have in Syria. That they have the same role in Syria that we have in Iraq, right? They're basically helping turn it into fucking bloodbath. But their role is similar to ours. So this is the way that our military system worked. And they're not just treaties, but we had an entire program. I think that from the late 1940s to until I think they changed the name in the 1960s. We had something called the Mutual Security Program, and there was this big program in that we had to get billions of dollars of appropriation every year in Congress, which essentially set the military aid programs all over the world. And from this stems the entire American global network. And there was a book by a guy named Chester Patch called Arming the Free World, which I think is if you're interested in reading this is not the Ledbetter book that I suggested earlier is like a wonderful read. You can be anyone and read this book and you will get like this. It's awesome. Now Chester's Patch, for a historian, this is a fucking great book.
Academic tone.
But this is a very academic book. So I'm suggesting this book when you come into it, understand that if you don't understand much of the shit that's going on, it's because it's a conversation that's going on with other people who've written on the subject. So that's really the big difference, right? When we say we're a Gonzo podcast, it's because we're just talking shit here with you guys, right? And it's supposed to be accessible to everyone. And the reason why foreign policy is hard to talk about with just the rest of us is because people who are in the national security establishment have their own jargon and language and publications. People who work in history have their own jargon and language and publications. Although historians are but historians are good about the jargon, though, right?
Yeah,
jargon is not for us. The problem is that you need to be aware of the conversation that's been happening. So a book can be a response to another book, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a book called Preponderance of Power. By a guy named Melvin Leffler. I don't know if he's emeritus yet, but he's up there.
I think he's still teaching.
He's still teaching, and Leffler's the nicest fucking dude. He's your Jewish grandpa, right?
It's funny. I don't know him personally.
I met him,
but
and he was like the nicest fucking guy in the entire world. All right.
My advisor was Nelson Lichtenstein, and apparently they both worked at the University of Virginia at the time, and they're both Jewish left intellectuals, and they did not get along.
Oh, really? I met Leffler, and he was lovely. And and John Lewis Gaddis, who wrote We Know Now, which didn't happen. But I always say this, though. When I email people for grad schools, the only person who answered back was John Gaddis when I was applying.
Funny.
And I tell that's an acid test. If you're applying to PhD programs, you're radioactive until they accept you. Yeah. And if you email professors, there's lots of people out there who are nice, but there's lots of people who aren't. When I applied to grad schools, the only person who emailed me back was John Gaddis, and he was super cool. He let me know that it's tough to get in.
Yeah.
Actually, Walt Lefebvre emailed me back. I'm wrong. Walter Lefebvre
to
warn me it was hard to get into grad school. And Walter Lefebvre, who is also the most wonderful person in the entire world. I will tell you, Walt Lefebvre is the coolest dude. I want to tell you a story because this is important. It's recorded. But I was taking class with him with Mike Schmidley, who works on Argentina. Also, nicest fucking dude in the world. Yeah. The foreign policy people and the historian side is full of nice fucking people. That's one thing. The people who work in foreign policy from the historian side, there are a lot of cool dudes and a lot of cool ladies. This is a good field. Yeah. And
just real quick before we go on, I just wanted to clarify for the audience, Walter Lefebvre is like the grandfather of Cold War revisionism. University of Wisconsin professor, studied under William Appleman Williams, another very pro-revisionist historian. And revisionist history it's a bigger concept in history. Don't think of it as a bad thing. It just means that you're challenging the status quo, which was definitely what Walter Lefebvre was doing. So anyway, now continue.
Well, to contextualize what kind of human being Walter Lefebvre is, when Mike and I, we just took it was like an independent study with Walter Lefebvre. Yeah. And independent study in grad school is intense. Mm-hmm. It's not like, it means that we're reading 2 books a week and you want to talk about them. And he said, show up around
comp exam.
Yeah, can you come to my office by 5:30? And then he was having office hours, right?
Yeah.
And there was a line out the door of undergraduates wanting to just get their face in front of Walter Lefebvre to talk to him. And you'd think that he would treat this as a rubber stamping.
Yeah.
I swear on my fucking life, this guy would the person would sit in front of him and all his attention to everything in the world would disappear, and he would probe and ask questions about the undergraduates. Where are you from? Who are your parents? What is it what are you studying? And he would spend, I swear, 15, 20 minutes with each undergraduate, picking their brains, asking every possible question. And they felt like they were not on the spot, but this guy was interested in him. And so when Lefebvre retired, they had, I think, at Carnegie Hall, a last goodbye lecture. And it was 10,000 people. And let me tell you that it wasn't because he was famous. It was because that many students had connected with this guy over his fucking 60-year career, or whatever it was, or 50-year career.
Something
teaching
that.
since 1963 at Cornell. And he was, and
back in the day when they actually had academic jobs for PhDs.
And then he would spend an hour, 2 hours with Mike Schmidley and me talking about fucking Henry Adams.
That's awesome.
And then the next year was me and Hajime Masuda and Seth Ackerman. Hajime, who's now a big guy in the field.
Yeah.
Right? Also, Hajime was a friend of mine. He's
he came out to UCSB once.
He's a doll of a human being.
Very friendly guy.
Not just friendly. He is
my one day interaction.
He is one of my favorite human beings on planet Earth. He is the nicest fucking guy. Anyways, we're here we're here just telling people how fucking awesome people we worked with were. And I'm not in the academy anymore, but I left because I was sick. I didn't leave because I hated the academy. Everyone I worked with was amazing.
Lots of people do that.
Whether it was Fred Logovar or Holly Case, I'm here tipping my drink to them. They were the best human beings I encountered. Anyways, people like us aren't the ones who determine foreign policy. We're the post-mortem people. Yeah. So we're here talking about
the State Department officials.
When you're here wondering if everyone who works on foreign policy is so nice, why is it so fucked up? Because the people who write about it aren't the ones who are implementing foreign policy.
The people who implement foreign policy do not want to hear the words of historians because they are very critical of these policymakers.
We are the ones who pick it apart, and that is an issue. Now, if you hear a clacking sound in the interview, it's me playing with a pen. I'm putting it down because we have we're here doing this on bare bones, but the microphone we have is amazing, and yeah. So if you hear a clacking sound, that's me. I apologize. But yeah, so we're not the ones who implement policy. We're not the ones. We're usually the ones who distill it to talk to people about the policy. And that is and that's one of the disjunctures between the academic study of foreign policy and the implementation. But the holy grail for people like us, for a lot of us, like John Gaddis was desperate, I heard. I don't know if this is true. Desperate for the Bush administration to give him a foreign policy position. And John Gaddis, again, I interpret him as a nice guy. I don't agree with his positions at all in the Cold War. Yeah. But I mean, as far as I know, he's a cool dude. So this saying that isn't me saying, oh, he's begging for a position. But a lot of foreign policy historians and people who work in political science, that one of their big hopes is that they get a position. Samantha Power got a position in the Obama administration, right? She's an academic.
Condoleezza
Rice is a Stanford, Michigan academic. And these people, one thing they hope for is an appointment. But as Samantha Power wrote about recently, and she wrote an article about this, is once you become part of the establishment, you find yourself, having to abandon all this shit that you believed in when you were writing about it, assessing it as a human being. Power has that effect on you, and the power of others has that effect on you. It's fucking crazy. Once you're the person who's sitting in the once you're Joffrey Baratheon, you find yourself, pulling wings off flies or killing puppies. Just like
I wonder
else.
if Samantha Powers or Condoleezza Rice, if they weren't already predisposed to accepting the ideas of the foreign policy establishment. Because you can read her The Problem from Hell book. It's all about, there's nothing in there about the United States foreign policy being the problem from hell. It's other countries that are.
It's other countries. But I think but in Samantha Power's case, at least she might have thought of herself as being better than that. Yeah. And she was surprised to find out she wasn't. But I think Condoleezza Rice was what she was.
I mean, Christ, the woman's got a fucking oil tanker named after her from Chevron.
Yeah. Well, everyone who was part of that new conservative movement that invaded Iraq was putting into action these political science beliefs, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, 9/11 was a fucking gift for those neocons.
It really was, because
you go back to 2000, the Project for New American Century, where they were already talking about these ideas of overthrowing the government in Iraq and instilling democracy. Whatever they actually maybe they actually believe
people
that.
Who don't believe in democracy at home.
Yeah,
trying to push it abroad is a real issue. The Republic at the time that these guys are invading Iraq. Karl Rove is talking about creating a permanent Republican majority in the United States, saying that if someone who believes in democracy, you thinking of your political position as being a political majority permanently shows that you don't have democratic beliefs, that you have authoritarian beliefs. And right now, the Trump administration is basically a rehash of a lot of Bush officials. Many of them don't survive for very long, like John Bolton, but in the sense this is a Bush Part 3. And that's what people are having difficulty understanding in this revision of George W. Bush as maybe not so bad, is that the reason why right now is so bad is because all those people, Elaine Chao is back, John Bolton's back, and all these people are rehashing a nightmare that we had in the aughts that ended in a fucking recession. Are we going to wait until we have a recession or calamity in order for us to say, well, it's pretty bad, we should wait till the next election then and elect the Democrat? And I think that we'll literally survive.
Look at how far right these Democrats have gone.
Well, man, I wonder sometimes if the lack of, and I wanted to segue into this, is the lack of acceptance of the right to protest in the United States is playing into this, is that our dissent in the United States has primarily expressed itself as people losing white privilege, right? We will accept that certain sectors of American society can protest. And they can protest in ways which are, that end up putting kids in cages. Yeah. You're tired about, these communities which don't have a connection to immigration. They have very few immigrants among them, amongst the most fervent supporters of policies that put, children into cages and families being separated. And they voted the people who do this in office in part because they felt like the government wasn't responding to them. But as soon as someone starts to go to the streets to protest,
and suddenly, like the funny thing about America is, you go back. This is a much larger conversation, but this is a country that was born out of revolution, and yet we're very fearful of that term revolution. We don't really, we have this in our very First Amendment. Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, the ability to protest. First Amendment to the Constitution, something that the Anti-Federalists were very much adamant about before they ratified this Constitution. They wanted to have some guarantee that you would have the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, the ability to protest your government.
George Washington and John Adams weren't that cool with that afterwards. When they actually got into office, they wanted to suppress the press, right?
Not the XYZ, only the Whiskey Rebellion, the Alien and Sedition Acts. I mean, just different ways of like putting down protest, censoring speech that was critical, And it's a bigger conversation that you could go throughout American history and look at.
And one thing that, I believe I learned this from Professor Lefebvre, was Americans are very anti-revolution. They believe that the only good revolution was the American Revolution.
After the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution.
Exactly. So the French and Haitian Revolution sort of create this dilemma where you had the one good revolution, in part because it came from these white guys in power, right, who are from the upper class.
So, let's continue with it. I was going to go on and say, what kind of a revolution was that even really? Was it, one of the big questions we always ask in the field is, was the American Revolution even a revolution?
Right.
Because, look, who's in power? It's rich white guys. There's no democracy in the United States.
It's more like the American secession.
Yeah.
It's more like the American secession from the British Empire. And
it's certain elites are going to have power in America, not the common person. They don't trust the common man. Look at Federalist number 10.
Although Hannah Arendt, I don't know if you guys know who Hannah Arendt is, but of course Henry knows. But Hannah Arendt was probably the most important political philosopher, I guess, of the 20th century.
Arguably, yeah.
She's, I believe that, but at least for me, she's my most important political philosophy thinker. But she was the most influential with me. And she did put her finger down on one thing about the American Revolution, is that she thought that at the very inception, right, it was one of the few good revolutions in the sense that it created the very idea of representation as being important, even though representation was restricted. And because of that, and this is me extrapolating this, I don't believe she makes this argument, but one of the things I've always extrapolated is that the fact that dissent in American society has been able to widen representation since the American Revolution is because in the original conception of the American Revolution, representation was codified. Right, all men are created equal. You don't mention women, and it's explicitly excluding non-white landowning men. But once you keep chipping away at that, you end up having the Civil War, and you have the Civil Rights Movement. All of a sudden, participation in American society increases. And what happens is that in 2019, what you see is that you're seeing a pushback against the entire fucking progression of history, which is to sort of expand representation in the United States, citizenship for undocumented people, economic equality. I mean, everything is moving.
Rights for transgender people.
Rights for transgender people and for
gay marriage. And we're continuing to extend those civil liberties.
Why the hysteria then for white folks? Is because shit, we don't own this anymore.
Yeah.
Well, what the fuck is this? We're gonna vote in Donald Trump and tell all you fuck you.
Basically, that's the only reason you vote for Donald Trump is to say fuck you to the rest of the country.
And what is progressivism, right?
Yeah. Fuck you to progressivism. Fuck you to the whole evolution of liberalism. Let's roll it back. Roll it back from not just the New Deal, but roll it back to Reconstruction, basically.
Well, I mean that's the concern, right? Is that the Trump administration has, in particular, gone after undocumented people and refugees. The immigration is not really slowed under Trump, but one place where they have put law enforcement and national security at the forefront is in immigration policy. And they've gone after refugees and asylum seekers with a ferocity that demonstrates that they're trying to start with the weakest elements of society so they can disenfranchise later on more people. Because, however you want to put your head in the sand, in Georgia in the last election, Kemp was able to get, 50,000 or 80,000 people off the voter rolls, and that provided his margin of victory against Stacey Abrams.
We've seen this. We've seen this play out. This tactic. They did that in Florida in 2000 with the voter rolls. I forget the exact thing that happened there, but it was something else that happened with with
the convicts.
Yeah, I was gonna say with the convicts there.
And what you do is that you try to reduce voter participation, so that way only white folks vote.
You do it anonymously. You send out something to like the poor black neighborhoods, and you say to them, make sure you come out and vote on Thursday. You send out a robocall.
I think the particular audience who might listen to this podcast, and hopefully more than just that listen to this podcast, right, might, think of that and be like, well, obviously, right? But it's not obvious.
Yeah.
This takes effort. It takes organization. You have to have a concerted policy of doing this, and someone has to direct it. Sometimes it can be really informal. Like we know from the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of the violence that happened against, African Americans and civil rights workers was low-level intensity violence that you saw occurring all over the South. You didn't need a lot of local leadership in order to do that. People would feel compelled to do it. But here in the United States in 2019, you have to have some sort of direction from the Republican Party, essentially.
And they're picking up some of these older ideas, like, in the post-Civil War era, when we start to, expand voting rights for African Americans. Well, hey, what if we put a poll tax on there to prevent them from going to the polls? So now they start trying to, why don't you have your ID so that when you go to the polls, show your ID. Finding various ways in which to make sure that, cause a problem where there hasn't been a problem. There's been no issues with people like falsely voting. That's not an issue that we have. You don't really need to have your ID to go there because nobody's going in falsely voting for someone else. Yeah. It's a crime that's not actually happening. But let's put a law in place.
And keep in mind that, and it's not that necessarily that white Americans are the bad guys in this, as a demographic, because I think a majority of white women right now in the 2020 election will probably vote Democratic. And the issue is that privilege in the United States, because it was codified, and that's something that people have to keep in mind when discussing this, the codification of white supremacy as the basis for your rights in society meant that white men in particular view the changing of the guard, that changing as being a threat to their own position in society. And not all white men, right? Now, I hate having to qualify that because people on the internet always do this, but one has to say this, right? That in order to be allies to the rest of society requires acknowledging that everyone deserves the same rights as you do. And Henry's a white guy. I'm a white Latino, right? So we see this every day in the way people treat us. And I'm a white Latino, so it's interesting for me because in person I rarely get any problems. But on the internet, when I'm just using my name and using my mom's dog and my wife's stuffed animal as my profile picture, right? And only have my name, then I get into a lot of trouble. I get a lot of fucking, you don't speak English very well and stuff like that. So, we understand. But, I think that it comes down to the acceptance of dissent for white Americans. Yeah. The way they feel that, there's a certain way to do it, there's a certain time to do it. And, hey, if you can't even have a civil society, how can you go abroad and produce democracy? And that's one problem that Americans have not resolved. That they have a foreign policy which is not, what's the word? How they usually say, we can't be...
it's not quite compatible, if you will, with, like the idea, our foreign policy is not compatible with, like, a democracy, a republic.
Well, we can't be indifferent to the fate of democracy abroad. But what happens when we're indifferent to the fate of democracy at home?
Yes.
And that's really the big issue Americans have. And when I talk to a lot of my white friends, one of the biggest problems is dismissiveness, right? The usual response when I bring something that is against our worldview is that, come on. That "come on" is probably the most common response I get from my white American friends when I tell them about voter suppression in the South, talk about the way that they treat transgender people, and even in California, there's the acceptance of transgender people and the idea that gender identity is fluid. I mean, the oh come on.
Yeah.
And if you can come on at home about stuff, then you can come on about Afghanistan. You can come on about Iraq. You can convince yourself to kill anyone if you're indifferent to it.
You convince yourself that this guy who Trump pardoned was actually a good guy, just doing his job over there, even though he fucking murdered the guy.
We're all doing our jobs.
Yeah. There were commenters on the Washington Post article who were poo-pooing the whole Afghan Papers.
I saw that. Yeah, I saw the Twitter. Like national security, the verified check marks on Twitter were just like, well, I was in Afghanistan, or I worked on Afghanistan. But hey, you know what? In Vietnam, you know how much great people worked on development programs in South Vietnam.
What was the name of that book? The Most Brilliant Minds.
I mean, there were a lot of people who went into Afghanistan who wanted to develop. I did some research for a professor, I think, at University of Kansas, about one guy who's running a particular program in the villages in South Vietnam. I mean, there were a lot of programs. They're trying to teach them how to fucking farm more efficiently, trying to build them up, trying to build security for them.
You have brilliant men working on it, Robert McNamara, the whiz kids.
But the strategic goal wasn't there.
Yeah.
Your nation building were a place where you can't just come in and decide that these people need to start having a common history. We're historians, right? Developing a common history is something that is very difficult.
Yeah.
Nation states, kill each other over this shit.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, like a common history.
I gotta do that. I always ask right when I say something. I'm like, don't you get it?
I mean, it's more than that, just a common history, but even like a common narrative, which I think we really need to start pushing back on, like the common narrative about the United States always being this off to doing good things in the world, protecting humanity.
Guys,
Vietnam was just a little aberration.
We're the Mongol invaders of Iraq. That's been our effect in the Middle East. The Middle East hasn't seen this type of upheaval since the fucking Mongol invasions. That's what we are. We're fucking Hulagu Khan smashing Baghdad and leaving everything in a fucking mess.
Another way to think about this is like the United States is almost in a way like ancient Greece was. Ancient Greece was like the epitome of democracy in the world. Elections. Everybody has a voice in there. You put your white pebble in, or you put your black pebble in. They had these fantastic theater performances. But what they were also doing was committed to military. They're committed to expanding the Greek Empire. They had their alliances, and they had their common enemy, the Spartans. And the Spartans have their own fucking little alliance, and what eventually happens was they went to war and fucking destroyed their democracy in the process.
They went to the Sicilian invasion, right? Alcibiades failed, and Alcibiades then defected to the Spartans, and that's what happens when you go around killing people. You try to, you can't go around killing folks and have people believe that you mean well.
Yeah.
And this is something that you listen to. You're listening to this right now, and I'm just telling you. As your foreign policy revolves around going abroad and killing people, you can't do right. And that's just a fact. War is wrong. Killing is wrong. When you have to fight, you should do it because you have no other recourse. And this is something that fails.
War shouldn't be your first option.
It should be your absolute last option. For Americans, war is just a way of life.
Yeah. Well, go back to William Appleman Williams. Empire as a way of life. And, it really kind of is for America.
And we just don't like to use that. We won't be able to do better at home until we realize that. And in part because people at home don't accept this. A significant portion of the American electorate, believes in some of these wars, or believes that we have to do these things at least periodically in order to remind people that we're strong. And what the fuck is the point of that? Because it doesn't prove that we're strong, it proves that we're scared. And that is one of the problems with containment as a framework for your foreign policy, is the foreign policy a frightened group of people. If something scares you, you want to keep it from spreading everywhere. And I'm for democratization all over the world. Mm-hmm. But that has to be something that the representation has to come from within.
You can't force that from you can't go in and impose that from behind the barrel of a gun.
And I can tell you, the long-term foreign policy, both Russia and China, which are the largest authoritarian states in the world right now, and I think India is moving in that direction a little bit.
Yeah, the States is moving in that direction too.
China is, in particular, is going to face foreign policy failure in the long term, because you can't have a system that is kleptocratic and non-representative.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing is that Americans may have, I think conservative Americans have this idea that maybe one day the Chinese government will be overthrown. When China eventually democratizes, it's not going to be something that Americans are going to be able to capitalize on.
Yeah.
I can tell you that. When representation comes to China, it's going to be representation that the Chinese are going to determine for themselves.
Yeah.
And that's something that I hope happens one day. I don't think that the Americans can actively create those conditions through their containment policy in China. That's not going to happen. In fact, it'll accomplish the opposite.
Yeah.
You want a China democratized, real, end the arms race. But as long as we worship the perpetual war state, we're not going to be able to really engage with the fact that we've produced nothing but strategic failure in the post-Cold War period. And if we won the Cold War, what the fuck did we win?
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that I struggle with. If we're in the situation we are right now, what the fuck did we win in the Cold War?
Yeah.
And I wonder what we're doing. I wonder what fucking Vladimir Putin doing, because, he's the Russian ruler who lost Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So any illusion that he's a strong ruler is fucking bullshit.
Yeah.
And Xi Jinping is claiming all of South China Sea and giving new life to American, security policy in the process. Now South Korea and Japan look at Americans and be like, well, South Korea after the Trump demand for billions of dollars is a different story. But before that, right? There was a reassessment. We thought that we were going to lose South Korea and Japan maybe in the long term. But hey, strategic failure is mutually shared. Basically, the world's lost its fucking mind. That's my assessment. That this nationalistic period is going to lead to a lot of failure. And that's what I feel, at least.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, plausible to see all these fucking systems collapsing on each other.
This is such a depressing note. We're at the 50-minute mark, and I'm thinking we got to wrap this shit up, and our rum has run out.
I'm out of this. This rum we were drinking was fucking fantastic.
God, Malahat Cabernet barrel-aged rum,
good
motherfuckers.
Fucking grief.
Wow, it's like complexity
it's
of
so
a scotch.
smooth.
And we got to get some of this shit to LeBron James, right? If LeBron James, are you listening to this podcast? I want you to go to fucking Tony Grillo and buy like 500 bottles of this shit and just tell the world how good it is. This is not an advertisement, by the way. We don't get any fucking...
I wish they were sponsoring the podcast.
No one's sponsoring this podcast. We're just literally staggering deliciousness while we were fucking here shooting the shit
lamenting
with you guys.
on the fucking state of the world.
But we are here in La Mesa, California, and I thank you all for listening. It is so fucking cool to even make this podcast. I know this podcast came out with 3 other podcasts on YouTube because I kept trying to build the website. And I had to learn how to use fucking Reaper, which is the software we use to clean this shit up.
We don't have fancy fucking engineers around here.
We don't have. It's me.
This is literally a table.
This is literally
with a microphone on it.
But this is the state of the academy, right? We're here being the tribune of plebs. We're tribunes of the plebs. Tribune of the pleb? No, tribunes of the plebs here in La Mesa, California. Here from